If you're having trouble making your trap beats sound good when you're mixing them, there could be a number of reasons why. Today I'm going to be sharing the top 6 tips when it comes to mixing trap beats. Alright, so tip number 1 is the power of saturation. This is something that I recently discovered, just how powerful and important saturation can be in your beats. If you're having trouble making your beats sound like they're fully cohesive, like all the instruments mesh together, this could be the reason why. So you might be wondering, what exactly does a saturator do? So I'm going to go into my 808 here and open up a saturator just to show you exactly what's happening. So here's the frequency range of my 808 without a saturator working. And if I turn the saturator all the way up, just as an extreme example, we can see in the mid-range here, there's a lot more going on in terms of our frequency range. And this is why saturators can be so powerful. We have our instruments that take up each of their own frequency ranges in our beat. But if those frequency ranges in our beat are completely different from each other, and we have these huge gaps in between our frequency ranges, we can get a very cold and disconnected feeling in our beat. What a saturator is going to do is take our instrument that has its own frequency range and it's going to add adjacent frequency presence to that instrument. So now if I play this beat and it has all the saturators on, you can hear how it sounds. But if I were to go in and turn each and every saturator effect off in my beat, you guys can hear a big difference. What's happening is each of our instruments is taking up less room in the broad frequency range of the overall beat. So naturally what's going to happen is we're going to end up having these gaps in the frequency ranges where there's no instruments playing and the beat's going to feel a little bit more disconnected. Whenever I make beats, I pretty much have a saturator effect on most of the main instruments plus all of my drums. It just helps to create a more full sounding beat. Tip number 2 is the power of reverb. When I first started making beats, this is something that I really struggled with. I'd either put too much reverb on pretty much every single instrument or no reverb at all on every single instrument. It was sort of an all or nothing type of thing. What I eventually realized when you're using reverb is that some instruments should have a small amount of reverb, other instruments should have a lot of reverb. The idea is that we're trying to play with the foreground and the background of our beat. We want some instruments to be in the foreground, very immediate, and we also want to play with where each of our instruments are going to fall in the background behind those instruments. So once again, this is how the beat sounds if I turned off all of the reverb on every single instrument. And once again, this is how the beat sounds once I start adding reverb to various instruments. As you guys can hear, it just sounds a lot more full and robust, and that's the power of reverb. What I'd advise is to keep your drums relatively dry. Those are the instruments that maybe you shouldn't add reverb onto. And in terms of all of your other instruments, just play around with how far back in the mix you want them. Again, these are not hard and fast rules. I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm not saying it's a good idea in every single situation, but if you're a beginner and you're trying to play around with reverb, you don't know what to do exactly, maybe that's a good strategy to start out with. Tip number 3 is EQing our 808s. So this is something that I see a lot of. What producers want to do is take their 808s and make them as booming and bassy as possible. So what they'll do is they'll go into their 808, for example, they'll open up an EQ on top and they will just start boosting these low frequencies to get as much bass as possible. What they'll also do is maybe go in and add Fruity Bass Booster on top, just completely overkill the bass in the 808. So I've gone in, I've completely boosted the bass of my 808. I want you guys to hear how the beat sounds now. So you guys can hear when the 808's playing, the volume of our overall track seems to dip over and over again. And this is why it's important to cut out the frequencies in the 808 that you don't need. This is something that I touched on in my video last week about making your own 808s. Most speakers don't have the ability to play anything under 40 Hertz. So generally what a good idea is to get rid of those frequencies underneath 40 Hertz in order to make more room for our more essential frequencies in our 808.
The
The reason why this is important to do is because there's only so much room in our beat in terms of overall headroom. If we have an 808 that has a ton of frequencies that our speakers aren't even able to produce, they're still taking up room in our beat. That's why you might run into that problem of when you're boosting your bass, it seems like no matter what you do, none of the instruments can get louder and louder in the mix. You might try turning up the volume of your other instruments, no matter what you do, they just sound quiet. And this is the reason why, because your 808 is taking up so much room that you can't even hear the rest of the instruments, but most of those frequencies in the 808 you can't even hear either. And so that's why it's super important to cut the frequencies out that you're not using in your 808 and just keep the ones that you actually need, which generally speaking is over 40 Hertz. Tip number 4 is the importance of panning and stereo width. So similar to reverb, what we wanted to play with in that example was the foreground and the background. What's also important is playing around with the left and right, the stereo width of our beat. If overall space in our beat is something that's important, it's not just something that's back and forth, it's also left and right. Generally, what you want to do is take instruments that have a similar frequency range and try to balance them in terms of where they are on the left and right channel. So for example, if you have hi-hats and an open hi-hat pattern, you might want to take your hi-hats and put them to the left channel. The open hi-hat can go to the right channel. These two instruments have very similar frequency ranges, and so to put them both to one side, it might sound a little bit lopsided. So for example, here's a bad example of what to do when you're panning. I have everything going to the left channel here, and all of these instruments have a very similar frequency range. So this is something that's generally a bad idea. What you want to do is take some of these instruments and put it to the opposite side, maybe not be as extreme, in order to get a good left and right balance. Another tool that I really find very powerful is a stereo mixing tool. So what this does is it allows you to control how wide or narrow an instrument is. For example, here I have my main instrument in the beat. Now if I turn this dial all the way to the left, what's going to happen is this instrument is going to become completely narrow and mono in the mix. And if I turn it all the way to the right, it's going to become a lot more wide in the mix. So this tool is very useful because we can control how wide or narrow a certain instrument is, and at that point we can choose where we want it in the mix, on the left side or the right side or the center, and it's just going to become a lot more easy to control. Tip number 5 is the importance of reductive EQ. So this tip is useful almost in the opposite way that a saturator was useful. With the first example, that was a very useful tool if we run into the problem where our beat sounds very cold and disconnected. What reductive EQ is going to do is help us in the scenario where our instruments have a lot of overlap, maybe too much, and it's making our beats sound very muddy and we can't really figure out why. For example, I have my instrument here that I use as a transition effect. So this is a sound that I would use just to take up some room in the high end, but if we open up an EQ on top to see which frequency range this instrument actually inhabits, we can see most of the frequencies that this sound actually takes up is mostly in the higher end. But we also have some low end here that we actually don't need this instrument to take up. So what I would do is completely cut out all of the frequencies that we don't need out of this instrument. It's not really a good idea to get too extreme and just completely cut off everything, because we might end up with very weak sounding instruments. This may seem like it's not going to be a very big deal, but it goes a long ways in the final product. All these small little changes that we make, all these small little cuts will go a long ways in making our beat sound a lot cleaner. Again though, we want to make sure we get a good balance. Going too extreme with our cuts is going to end up making our beat sound very disconnected. We're going to end up with the exact same problem we had in the first tip where we have to start adding saturators on top. It's a good idea to be balanced with both of these things. And finally, tip number 6, soft clipping. What I do is I treat the limiter as a sort of last resort, a brick wall, just to make sure there's no clipping going on. But I'll use the soft clipper in order to help control the overall gain of the beat and add a little bit of saturation to the beat as well. So what the soft clipper is doing is we're taking all of our instruments and we're adding volume to it. We can imagine this top part of the line here is total overall volume. And this top corner right here is the top amount of volume that we should have. And so as you guys can see, the top of the line here is probably going to go over this top corner here. So for example, if I push this to an extreme, and we open up our limiter, we can see we have a ton of instruments that are just going way over now. And that's the purpose of the threshold knob. I'm going to bring this down a little bit just to make sure it's not as an extreme example. Our threshold knob is going to help bring that overall maximum volume down into the top right corner, just so we don't have as much clipping and as much work that the hard limiter has to do. Now it's a lot more controlled. We have a lot less instruments that are going to sound overbearing and overpowered and just completely ruin our mix. But at the same time, we also increased the overall volume of our beat because we took every single instrument and increased the volume. So you guys can see that demonstrated here. If I were to turn the beat on without any soft clipper, we can see our overall output and look at how low some of these values are in our overall beat. But when I turn the soft clipper on, those values aren't as low now. We have a higher overall output in our beat. And so there you go. Those are 6 tips for you guys in order to improve your trap beat mixing. If you guys have found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe, leave a comment down below, do all that good stuff. Again, if you want to download my free kit, it is available to download in the description box below. And I'll see you guys next Tuesday.